we would never have, some years ago, at least the mainstream media, simply repeated what government/industry said uncritically and then tried to convince people that was the truth and not to believe certain other things. We would be playing more of an opposite role, a reasonable but skeptical audience that would ask for justification and present other viewpoints rather than just sort of serving as a mouthpiece for them. And it's the biggest turnaround to me to see the media willingly take an official position from people who have all kinds of conflicts of interest. It doesn't mean what they're saying isn't true, but there's certainly a lot of things to consider. But then uncritically try to convince the public to believe that viewpoint and not listen to anything else and censor other information. But in this way, it's made it very hard in a confused, chaotic environment like with coronavirus to get at the truth. Well, maybe we've made mistakes because we didn't know better because this thing is happening and developing and emerging. But then to get at the truth when information is closed off and we're only hearing one side and we're told that we can't listen to other things or other studies or other scientists, I think it's been a very harmful thing. And it's hard to know in every case whether the reporters simply are complicit because they just believe this is the right thing and they haven't been taught any other way of critically thinking about information and reporting, or if they're purposely placed there, they're not reporters anymore. I argue in one of my books that a lot of propagandists have become part of the media. We've invited them into our newsrooms. There was a point when we used to have a little bit of a firewall between the people we reported on and we, the reporters, but that's long ago gone, where we've not just invited them to influence what we report, but we've hired them. And again, not even just as pundits and analysts, but they are reporters, they are editorial presences within our newsrooms. Now we are one and the same. It's hard to say that there's a distinctive difference in many instances between the people trying to get out a message and the messengers in the media who should be doing a more independent job of reporting accurately.
Well, let's think about coronavirus here. Let's use it as kind of a case study. I mean, we're looking at early 2020. There's a lot of different information flying around. We know that the Chinese regime is basically doing mass censorship, preventing from these whistleblowers from, speaking and basically running a big information operation. And there's this fear that this is very serious. There's models being done that say going to be mass casualties. Lockdown policies get instituted very quickly. But then also very quickly, there's data being gathered that shows that it's not nearly as bad. You were kind of in the midst of this. I know you were looking at this carefully. So when did you realize there's something kind of amiss in how we're thinking about this?
Well, like most people, I didn't know what to believe in the beginning. And I try to be fairly careful as a reporter to forming conclusions and speaking about things. People were asking me early on what I thought about coronavirus and how bad was it and what was going to work. And I said I didn't know. But what happens for me anyway, the way I work, I talk to tons of people, all kinds of scientists, inside and outside government, whoever I can. And over a fairly short period of time, you start seeing who's right and who's wrong, who has a better track record. And pretty quickly, I could see that certain things that were being said publicly were bearing out as not true, and certain things that other scientists were telling me privately rang true, and in hindsight have actually been proven to be true. And you can start to develop, okay, which are the ones who seem to have their finger more on the pulse of what's going on. And pretty early on, I had quite a few scientists question, including government scientists, question the advice being given by Dr. Fauci and the lead scientists that were taking charge. And I remember saying to them, these were important differences they had with policy and what we were doing. And I said, shouldn't you say something? Shouldn't you speak out, at least be a voice and an opinion that's heard? And a couple of different ones said, that didn't, to my knowledge, even know each other, but said something similar. They said they dare not speak out for fear of being controversialized and for fear of being called coronavirus deniers, because that phrase was starting to be used in the media. And secondly, they feared contradicting Dr. Fauci, who they said had been kind of lionized or canonized in the press for reasons that they couldn't understand, because they really didn't think that his guidance that he was giving publicly was the right guidance. Now, who's to say whether at the time he was right or they were right? But I was simply saying, certainly these esteemed scientists who had differing opinions that made sense to me, certainly those opinions should be heard as well, and yet they weren't allowed, and in many cases were afraid to even speak out for fear of losing grants. I think people don't understand how the scientific world is so driven by the money they can get for research, and all of that virtually comes from the government or through the government. And if the government doesn't like what you say and do, I mean, that can like totally get you fired from your institution or make it where you never get a grant again. And a lot of people are afraid to talk about these things. So that started to strike me as this is a really dangerous environment when esteemed scientists who have valuable information and opinions are afraid to give them. And instead we're hearing a party line that many of them disagree with but won't say so.
You know, I'm just remembering this, that one of these scientists mentioned something like, well, it's a huge problem where the people that are giving the grants are the same people that are setting the policy. And, you know, I think, really, could that even be possible? And sure enough, you know, that is the case, or has been the case. That's incredible.
Well, and very specifically, I don't know if this is what you meant, but the people that gave grants, and this isn't even a matter of debate, despite what you may have heard in the news, public tax money was used to fund gain-of-function research. Maybe there are some details that are sort of in dispute or a little bit murky, but it's well documented that our taxpayer money was used over a period of years to fund controversial research involving the communist Chinese for some reason, which again, every scientist I spoke to behind the scenes thought that this partnership with the communist Chinese was one of the most ridiculous and ill-advised things they could ever think of, and yet they didn't want to say that publicly. But this is something that Dr. Fauci's Institute, the National Institutes of Health, had approved and funded, along with the USAID, Agency for International Development. Our Defense Department is part of all of this too. This stuff seems so ill-advised and is so well documented, and yet people are unwilling to talk about it, and then the narrative is being managed another way. I remember after reviewing the grants themselves, to my satisfaction, because I didn't know it was true till I found the documentation, and then still hearing not just public health figures, but reporters claim, as if they know the truth, that none of this had happened. And I'm thinking, you know, I can hardly blame the politicians and public health figures because they have their own idea of what their job is. But we in the media are supposed to, at least I think, do an independent job and do our own research and not just take at face value everything one side says. And yet I'm seeing all of this information reported that I know is false, saying certain things aren't true. And it's like early on, when reporters were saying that the idea that the virus could have come from a lab in China, it was widely being said that had been debunked when, as little as I knew that hadn't even been investigated yet. I knew the Chinese hadn't let us in the lab. I knew that we had very little information. How could reporters be saying unattributed that this whole thing has been debunked? So these are the kinds of things that early on, that's sort of a red flag to me that says somebody's trying to shape the information. They're using reporters to do it. Public health figures are involved in some instances, and that makes me want to know what's really behind it.